The most shocking royal death in the history of England took place in the dark corridors of Berkeley Castle. This is not a legend or a ghost story, it really happened. It occurred on the night of September 21, 1327, when former King Edward II, already deposed and broken, died a horrific death. His executioners restrained him, inserted a funnel-like tube into his rectum, and then used it to push a red-hot iron rod inside. By morning, his lifeless body was found. In official records, the cause of death was diplomatically listed as natural causes. The story of this murder is so gruesome that many historians still question whether it really happened. Edward himself had not been prepared from childhood for the cruelty that awaited him later in life. He was born on April 25, 1284, in Carnarvon, Wales, the fourth surviving son of the stern monarch Edward I, known as Longshanks. Even as a child, his personality stood out from what was considered normal for a noble. The future king loved water activities, swimming, rowing boats, practicing crafts, and eagerly talking to commoners. He could spend hours chatting with stable boys, blacksmiths, and carpenters, behavior that, in a rigidly hierarchical medieval society, seemed strange and even dangerous. His father, Edward I, was a formidable warrior, harsh, intelligent, and ruthless in politics. He was nicknamed the Hammer of the Scots for his successful military campaigns against the northern neighbors. He conquered Wales, subdued much of Scotland, and brought order to the feudal squabbles. Edward I hoped to see in his son a worthy successor to the English crown, but nature had other plans. When Edward came of age, he proved unprepared for the difficult choices that demanded iron will and political cunning. A pivotal figure in Edward's fate was the young companion Piers Gaveston, the son of a Gascon knight. Gaveston was handsome, clever, witty, and charismatic. Their friendship quickly grew into something more than camaraderie. Originally brought to the English court as a hostage, Gaveston soon became the crown prince's closest friend. After his father's death in 1307, the new king brought Gaveston back from exile, granted him the title of Earl of Cornwall, and bestowed immense wealth upon him. Gaveston was given control of the richest estates and became, in practice, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. At first, the courtiers gossiped, then they began to openly express their outrage. Gaveston behaved arrogantly, mocked English lords, and gave them insulting nicknames. He called the Earl of Lancaster an actor, the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden, and the Earl of Lincoln an old boar. Historians still debate the true nature of the relationship between the king and Gaveston, but all agree that Gaveston was the king's favorite and held tremendous influence over state affairs. Edward's marriage to Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV the Fair, only made things worse. Isabella was beautiful, intelligent, and well-educated, but at the wedding feast the young king paid little attention to his bride, spending all his time with Gaveston instead. The king gave Gaveston the jewels meant for the queen, seated him in the place of honor at banquets, and consulted with him on all matters. This sparked outrage among the English nobility, who saw Gaveston as an upstart foreigner disrupting the traditional order. In terms of intonation, a pivotal figure in Edward's fate was the young companion Piers Gaveston, the son of a Gascon knight. Gaveston was handsome, clever, witty, and charismatic. Their friendship quickly grew into something more than camaraderie. Originally brought to the English court as a hostage, Gaveston soon became the crown prince's closest friend. After his father's death in 1307, the new king brought Gaveston back from exile, granted him the title of Earl of Cornwall, and bestowed immense wealth upon him. Gaveston was given control of the richest estates and became, in practice, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. At first, the courtiers gossiped. Then they began to openly express their outrage. Gaveston behaved arrogantly, mocked English lords, and gave them insulting nicknames. He called the Earl of Lancaster an actor, the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden, and the Earl of Lincoln an old boar. Historians still debate the true nature of the relationship between the king and Gaveston, but all agree that Gaveston was the king's favorite and held tremendous influence over state affairs. Edward's marriage to Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV the Fair, only made things worse. Isabella was beautiful, intelligent, and well-educated, but at the wedding feast, the young king paid little attention to his bride, spending all his time with Gaveston instead. The king gave Gaveston the jewels meant for the queen, seated him in the place of honor at banquets, and consulted with him on all matters. This sparked outrage among the English nobility, who saw Gaveston as an upstart foreigner disrupting the traditional order. The English lords united against the king's favorite. They demanded Gaveston's exile, threatened rebellion, and eventually succeeded in having him banished. But the king secretly kept in contact with him, sending money and making plans for his return. When Gaveston came back to England, he was captured and executed in 1312. The killing was brutal. Gaveston was hacked to death with a sword right on the road without any form of trial. Edward was forced to accept the murder of his friend, but he never found inner peace with the killers, even though he made a temporary truce with them to preserve his throne. Edward II's policies disappointed even his most loyal supporters. His greatest failure came at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Edward had assembled a massive army, around 25,000 men, to finally conquer Scotland. But the Scottish king, Robert the Bruce, chose the battlefield brilliantly, used the terrain to his advantage, and outmaneuvered the English. The English army was crushed, and the king barely escaped capture. After this defeat, England effectively admitted its weakness, and Scotland became de facto independent. In administrative matters, the king was incompetent, appointing people to high office either out of friendship or personal whim. After Gaveston's death, new favorites emerged, Hugh Despenser the Elder and his son Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers proved to be even greedier and more unscrupulous than Gaveston. They became the true rulers of the country, using their positions to seize land and amass wealth. They confiscated estates from disfavored nobles, placed their allies in profitable posts, and essentially turned royal power into a tool for personal gain. All of this stirred not only jealousy but genuine hatred in Queen Isabella. As the daughter of the powerful French king, she had grown up accustomed to respect and influence. Instead, she was pushed aside, her voice ignored, while the Despensers openly showed her contempt. Isabella realized that her marriage had become a farce and that she herself had become a hostage to others' ambitions. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France under the pretense of diplomatic negotiations and refused to return as long as the Despensers held power. While in France, she met Roger Mortimer, one of the most powerful English barons who had escaped from the Tower of London and was hiding at the French court. Mortimer was an experienced warrior, a shrewd politician, and a charismatic man. A relationship soon developed between them, one that quickly turned into a passionate romance and political alliance. Together, they assembled a small but effective army of mercenaries, gained the support of the French king and Flemish cities, and in 1326 landed in England. To their surprise, the uprising against Edward II and the Despensers became widespread. English barons, townspeople, and even some of the clergy sided with Isabella. Edward and the Despensers fled to Wales, but they were soon captured. In January of 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward. The abdication ceremony took place at Kenilworth Castle in the presence of Parliament. The former king wept and pleaded for mercy, but he was made to understand the alternative to abdication was far worse. Afterward, he was transferred to Berkeley Castle under the guard of Thomas Berkeley, John Maltravers, and Thomas Gurney. At first, the conditions of Edward's imprisonment were relatively mild, but they gradually worsened. Isabella and Mortimer understood that as long as the former king remained alive, he would pose a constant threat. Edward was kept in a damp cell, deprived of proper food, and denied the ability to bathe. Guards mocked him, forced him to ride naked on horseback, shaved him with cold water from a ditch, and may have subjected him to psychological torment. All of this was meant to break his spirit and lead to a natural death, but Edward proved more resilient than expected. Finally, on the 21st of September 1327, a horrific execution took place. The most widely accepted version, recorded by chroniclers, claims that the killers, wishing to leave no visible marks on the body, chose a particularly cruel method. They restrained the victim, inserted an animal horn or copper tube into his rectum, and then drove a red-hot iron rod through it. Death was excruciating, but no external signs of violence remained on the corpse. This story is regularly questioned by modern historians. Many believe it to be the product of political propaganda. Tales of elaborate torture made it easier to defame an enemy and justify one's own actions. It is possible Edward was simply strangled or poisoned, and the gruesome details were invented later. There are also alternative versions. In 1333, the so-called Fieschi letter appeared, a document whose author claimed that King Edward had not been killed, but had escaped from Berkeley Castle with the help of a gatekeeper. According to this account, a servant who resembled the king was murdered in his place, while Edward fled to France and eventually to Italy, where he lived out his final years as a hermit in a monastery. In 1338, a man named William the Welshman presented himself as Edward II during an audience with Holy Roman Emperor Louis of Bavaria. This man knew details of the English court, spoke both French and English, and gave the impression of being a noble. The emperor even granted him a small allowance and wrote to Edward III asking him to investigate his father's fate. Most scholars find these accounts unconvincing. Too many people had a vested interest in Edward's death, and Berkeley Castle was too well guarded. But as always, the mysteries of the Middle Ages resist complete resolution, and legends live on for centuries. The funeral of the former monarch took place in December 1327 at Gloucester Cathedral. His body was carefully embalmed, which made it impossible for physicians to determine the exact cause of death. The ceremony was attended by the new king, Edward III, who, once grown, made efforts to identify and punish those responsible for his father's death. Thomas Gurney was captured in Marseille and executed, and the Maltravers family was exiled and stripped of all their holdings. The story of Edward II had a lasting impact on culture. In the late 16th century, English poet and playwright Christopher Marlowe wrote the tragedy Edward II, seeing in this tale the drama of a man broken by his own desires and political cruelty. Marlowe's play became one of the masterpieces of Elizabethan drama and shaped the enduring image of Edward as a tragic hero. The deposition of a king anointed by God created a dangerous precedent. The old order, in which the monarch was considered an untouchable divine representative, had been broken. Future English kings remembered Edward's fate and tried not to let their conflicts with subjects go too far. Over time, the association between Edward's unusual sexuality and his horrific death became a permanent fixture in European cultural memory. The drama of personal desire versus state duty, the conflict between human weakness and royal responsibility, remains a vivid example of power's unsolvable contradictions. Today, the tomb of Edward II in Gloucester Cathedral still draws visitors from around the world. On the marble tomb, a skilled sculptor carved a calm and majestic image of the monarch in royal robes, with a crown on his head and a scepter in his hand. Nothing in this stone face hints at the horrors of his final months or his agonizing death. This monument seems to deny the entire tragedy, presenting instead an idealized vision of royal dignity. What do you think? Was the story of Edward II's escape merely a myth, or could there be a grain of truth in it? And was his murder really as cruel as the chroniclers describe? Share your thoughts in the comments. Wishing you many fascinating historical discoveries. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and share your impressions below.